So if any housing project may have a significant effect on the environment, it requires an environmental impact report. And here's where the costs start. These environmental impact reports can cost anywhere between $200,000 or millions of dollars, depending upon the scope of the project. In addition, it takes a while to prepare these environmental impact reports. Some of them exceed 5,000 pages. And the legislative analyst has determined that of California's top 10 cities, where an environmental impact report is required, it takes 2.5 years from the proposal to the approval of the project. So you now have delay so that the costs you anticipated when you proposed the project have now increased in 2.5 years. But it's not just the millions in the environmental impact reports and the delay and the cost that that entails. Once the project is approved, there is often litigation under CEQA by those who want to thwart or delay the project. Or for instance, unions use CEQA, and they say to the developer, unless you unionize, we think we see some issues with your environmental impact report. So either you consider unionization or there may be a CEQA suit. These suits can take 2 to 4 years. And there are attorney's fees, and the further delay increases further costs. So when the governor acknowledged that there's a supply problem in California with respect to housing, greater demand than supply, well, how do you supply more housing when it is so expensive? How do you provide more affordable housing when the costs make it too expensive to construct affordable housing? Now, clearly there are other costs that contribute to the cost of housing. There's the cost of real estate, construction costs, permitting delays, government fees, zoning, but CEQA clearly is a significant factor in the costs. So today, what I want to do is just take a couple of minutes to propose ways of cutting costs under CEQA without eliminating it, but cutting them. And there are 3 reforms that, without affecting the obligation to do an environmental impact report, could actually reduce the costs. One is every case under CEQA has a trial court proceeding and an appellate proceeding in the Court of Appeal. You could cut the time for litigation in half if, instead of having an appeal, you provided for a writ to review the trial court's decision. Because under California law with a writ, a court of appeal can summarily deny a meritless appeal without having an opinion, and they can do it in a few months. If the case had merit, then the Court of Appeal can take the appeal, and in fact, the legislature could even require that the Court of Appeal take the appeal if there's at least a 50% chance of the appellant prevailing on a particular issue. Reform 2, in order to bring a claim under CEQA, the claim has to have been presented while the report is being considered by the public. But many of those who oppose projects raise their complaint on the final day of the final appeal over the report before it's approved. It's about time that if you have a complaint about a draft environmental impact report or an issue in the report, that you bring it up in a timely manner before the comment period is completed for that particular report, and you raise it at the earliest time. That would avoid basically litigation by ambush and promote diligence. And the third reform is, how about a harmless error standard, where if the error really is not significant, that it is not a basis for overturning the environmental impact report and stopping the project. The legislature could codify a procedure that simply says that, notwithstanding an error in the report, and by the way, these reports are voluminous, as I say, thousands of pages. They are based on complicated analytic models as to how the project is going to impact decades in the future a particular pollutant or traffic. So it's easy to find some omission or issue in these reports. The legislature could codify a harmless error standard by which the legislature says that if the project would have been approved by the governmental agency, notwithstanding the error, and the error does not substantially affect the public's ability to understand the impacts of the project nonetheless gets approved. So with those three reforms, you could start bringing down some of the costs that are affecting not only housing, but other construction in the state. In comparison, if you look at what the governor proposed in the State of the State, he said that he would propose $750 million as an incentive package for communities to upgrade their housing plans and zoning. The bipartisan legislative analyst, however, determined that if you wanted to build affordable housing for low-income families just on the coasts, it would cost $250 billion. So a $750 million incentive package, is that really going to solve the problem of affordable housing when it would cost $250 billion to provide affordable housing just along the coast in the state? No, what the legislature needs to do is start reducing the costs of housing so that it becomes affordable to develop, and one of the low-hanging fruits is CEQA. So with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, who will introduce the panel, Wayne Winegarden.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to be very quick just because I want to get to these guys here. They really, I think, are going to bring some important perspective on kind of the whole environmental, global warming, global climate change issue. And really what we want to bring attention to is the idea that all of these policies have consequences. Right? I think everyone's familiar with the Green New Deal. We're going to save the world in 10 years. And what they don't talk about, and there was a great study that they looked at, okay, let's say we're going to power the economy with just wind power, right? How much space do you need? And to get today's economy powered just by wind power, what you basically need to do is cover all of California with wind turbines, the entire state, cover it with wind turbines, turn California over and cover that area with wind turbines as well, and then we can power the entire economy. That's all it takes. The silliness of that, the inability to actually do that, the idea that most localities, not most, but there's localities in California now that are actually trying to ban these wind turbines, it shows you that there's consequences to these policies. Whether they're intended or not is irrelevant, there's consequences. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today, right? So the first time, what I want is bring up Nick Loris from Heritage Foundation, and he wants to talk about the technical issues, right? Can we actually achieve what these technologies say? What's the consequences, both from a technological as well as an economic perspective? Nick is the Herbert and Joyce Morgan Fellow in Energy and Environment at the Heritage Foundation, and obviously focuses on environmental and regulatory issues. And he, specifically in terms of climate change, energy efficiency mandates, energy subsidies, all of these kind of issues in terms of what are the economic and technical kind of rationale around global warming policies. And with that, I'd like to bring up Nick.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me here. It's a delight to be out of Washington, D.C. for sure. Before I get started on that, I wanted to touch on some of the things that Wayne and Henry talked about in the healthcare discussion. When Henry was talking about a lot of the systemic problems with EPA regulations, that's essentially what you see across the board in energy and environment policy, is that these regulators are essentially on autopilot. And yes, we want clean air, we want drinkable water, but what we see now are increasingly stringent regulations for diminishing marginal returns in terms of environmental benefits. And so the compliance costs are getting higher and higher, and they're being passed on to consumers, they're being passed on to households and other businesses, and you're seeing very small environmental returns, almost to a point where they're non-existent. And climate change regulations, epitomize that issue. If you look at some of the climate policies that are already enacted in places like California and certain states that have renewable electricity mandates, if you look at some of the federal policies that have been proposed, whether it's cap and trade legislation, or carbon taxes, all of these policies have very high cost to consumers because One, they're going to raise your electricity bills. We remember when President Obama was in San Francisco campaigning for president, he said, under my cap and trade plan, electricity rates will necessarily skyrocket because you need to drive the cost of energy up so people use less energy to reduce the CO2 emissions. And that has tremendous ripple effects throughout the economy because you're not just hit when you pay your electricity bill every month, and you're not just hit when you go to the gas station. Because energy is such a necessary component of everything we make and everything we do, you're hit again and again when you go to the grocery store, when you go to Walmart, when you go out to eat. All of this policy acts as kind of an economic vice that squeezes the production side and the consumption side, so you get huge costs in terms of tens of thousands of dollars in lost income, multiple trillion-dollar hits to the economy, and so those are the costs. If you look at the actual benefits, what are we going to get in terms of abated temperature warming, right? Because that's what climate change regulation is all about. It's not about combating smog or reducing hazardous air pollutants that we know have adverse impacts on human health and the environment. We know CO2 is a colorless, odorless, non-toxic gas, and the only reason that it's being regulated is because of its alleged impact on global warming, rising sea levels, all of that. Even if you buy into the fact that we need to do something about climate change, and there's a whole robust discussion that we can have about that we can save for another day, even if we were to implement all of these policies, whether it's a Green New Deal that forces us to go 100% renewables within 10 years, essentially eliminate the internal combustion engine, and have net zero greenhouse gas emissions in 10 to 12 years. Even if we were to do that and essentially grind our economy to a halt, you would only be mitigating global temperatures less than 0.2 of a degree Celsius by the turn of the century. You'd be abating maybe 2 centimeters of sea level rise because we're only a small part of the global economy. We're about 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and you have the developing world who is prioritizing economic growth and has energy poverty on magnitude scales different than what we have here in the United States. When you have more than 1 billion people without access to reliable, affordable power, they want it any way they can get it. And that means building a lot more coal-fired power plants, natural gas plants. Yes, they're building more renewables and expanding nuclear as well. But they're going to be using conventional fuels well into the future. And so all of these climate policies that we have here in the United States come at extreme costs and have no meaningful impact on the climate whatsoever. And again, I think it's kind of a microcosm of what's happened in California. The Green New Deal is essentially that on steroids times 1,000,000. When they're talking about changes in lifestyle, whether it's reducing or eliminating the consumption of beef, changing the way we harvest crops and raise livestock, changing the way that we drive cars and get around. And that's essentially what you get from a lot of these policies. It's not necessarily about climate change. It's about restricting choice and centralizing power in Washington. David Brooks, a columnist for the New York Times, essentially said that. He said that if the Green New Deal were enacted, it would be the greatest centralization of power among our Washington elite in the history of the United States. And I don't think he was being hyperbolic there because of everything that the Green New Deal talks about. And again, we see this all the time on smaller levels, both at the state level and in Washington. One of the things I was reminded of a few days ago is a regulation that was implemented in the Obama administration that was mandating energy efficiency. And so we've had these energy efficiency and conservation standards dating back to the 70s when we thought we were running out of oil and we wanted to reduce our dependence on energy. During the Obama administration, they actually implemented a regulation about the size of a phone book that was for energy efficiency for microwave ovens on standby mode. So that means not even when you're actually using your microwave. It was literally just to regulate the energy that's coming out of the digital clock on the microwave. And so they spent about a year promulgating this regulation all for an estimated savings of $1.50 per year by regulating the energy efficiency of your microwave oven clock. And so that's what our bureaucrats in Washington are doing, and using your taxpayer money to regulate these types of things that they should have no business regulating whatsoever. And essentially that's what the Green New Deal would do, just at much more higher levels. And I think what strikes me as most disappointing from the Green New Deal is just all of the hypocrisy involved in something like the Green New Deal. They say that climate change is the world's most pressing issue and that we need to do something within 12 years or we're going to have catastrophic warming and the world's going to end. But they say we can't build new nuclear power plants, which is by far the largest source of CO2-free energy that we have on this planet, and they want to decommission the existing plants. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, one of the architects behind this policy, says, well, I don't like nuclear because of the uranium mining. Yet, I don't know where she's going to get the materials necessary for the wind turbines, for the photovoltaic cells, all which need rare earth minerals, not to mention the lithium-ion batteries, because we would need a lot more battery storage because the wind doesn't blow all the time and the sun doesn't shine all the time, so you need to back up all of this generation. So there's the hypocrisy in just what sources of energy they actually care about and want to meet these alleged greenhouse gas targets. Then there's the hypocrisy of economic justice, that we're doing these things to help poor and middle-income America. Well, as Wayne said, it's these policies that hit the poor and middle-income Americans the hardest because they spend a larger portion of their budget on energy policy. If you're driving up the cost of energy by essentially eliminating conventional fuels, which provide 92% of our transportation fuel and over 60% of our electricity needs, you are driving up the costs on the people who depend and need affordable, reliable energy the most. And so there's absolutely no economic justice in this plan. And then the last bit of hypocrisy that I'll touch on is just the amount of cronyism and corporate welfare that a policy like the Green New Deal would introduce. And one thing that I actually agreed with Representative Cortez on was her stance against corporate welfare for Amazon. I don't think they should be getting billions of dollars in tax subsidies to come to a certain state. But what do you think is going to happen if you need to spend $8 to $10 trillion reinventing our energy sector in the United States and have the federal government, aka the American taxpayer, pay for it? You are going to have a whole level of energy cronyism and corporate welfare that we've never seen before. And we've seen in places like California with something like Solyndra that got $500 million from the federal taxpayer and still couldn't be economically competitive even with that money. And if you look at that program, the loan guarantee program that the Department of Energy administers, there's a number of economic failures that couldn't stand up on its own legs, even with the help from the federal taxpayer, and not to mention all of the help that they get from other federal government policies and state policies as well, like the renewable electricity standards. But then if you look at some of the success stories, and this is my favorite because a lot of the people who are supportive of these policies say, yeah, well, Solyndra was just kind of a blip on the radar. There's been some failures, but overall the portfolio is doing quite well. And that is in fact true. But that just shows that these projects didn't need help from the federal government whatsoever. And if you look at some of the projects that were financed, they have backing from Goldman Sachs, they have backing from Google, they have backing from huge utilities. Some of the companies with the biggest market caps and the largest financiers in the world are behind these projects, yet we're having the federal government essentially and the taxpayers underwrite some of these projects. And so if you have that just with a small part of a loan guarantee program, imagine what would happen under a Green New Deal. And so all of this stuff, these policies at the state and the federal level are really more about restricting choice and raising energy costs that disproportionately hurt the poor, when instead what we need is more of what's worked in the United States. I think we've become the world's largest oil and natural gas producer for a reason, is that we have competitive free markets in very big segments of the energy sector. If you look at places like Texas that has competition in their retail electricity market, it's a wonderful way of how you can actually increase renewables because they can choose what electricity provider they want. And so Texas is a great state where you've seen tremendous amounts of competition. Yes, there's subsidies that we need to get rid of, but you've seen tremendous amounts of competition and increases in renewables, where Texas, if it were a country, would be the 5th largest wind-producing country in the world. And again, some of that is oversupplied by subsidies like the wind production tax credit. But you can shop around for retail providers like you can in many other states. In many other states, you get electricity bill in the month and you pay it, and it's just the cost of service. Here you can choose what provider you want. You can enter into short-term contracts, long-term contracts. You can choose 100% renewables if you want to. Those are the policies that will ultimately drive more innovation in our energy sector, and ultimately we can translate that into better technologies that we can freely trade around the world. And that's essentially how you can get better economic outcomes as well as better environmental outcomes. And I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, I think Nick gave a great kind of transition into John's kind of purpose of being here, and that's really to dive into not just the global warming, but also CEQA. How is this going to be impacting lower income communities, affordable housing, and really dive into those issues. So with that, I'd like to introduce John. Good morning.
Thank you. When I first came in this morning and I looked around, I says, I don't think I'm in the right place. But once I listened to all the speakers, I know I'm in the right place on it. Anyway, I'm going to deviate from my original talk because Dan gave it, and he gave it so well that I could never compare to that. So I'll deviate a little bit and tell you what we think. Communities of color have become collateral damage in the environmental community's war on climate change on it. The organization that I represent, we call ourselves the 200. It was started by community activists and civil rights, older members of the community or older activists that came up in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s on it. And some of the members that started this was former Supreme Court Justice Cruz Reynoso, Herman Gallegos, founder of the largest nonprofit in the country, National Council of La Raza, George Dean, former president of all of the urban leagues on it, Bruce Kwan, who is a community leader out of the Asian community, and he was also prosecuted Nixon and investigated the Watergate. So it was members like that. I call them veterans, but actually we're really old. And in fact, I'm 77, and I'm one of the youngest founders of the organization. We came together because we had come to the conclusion kind of individually that the wealth gap of communities of color was increasing, even in spite of all the years that we had worked on in civil rights and all of the regulatory agencies and laws, et cetera. If I remember correctly, in 2000, the wealth gap of white families, or the wealth of white families, was 6 times greater than it was for families of color. Today, it's 10 times greater. So when we looked at that and said, is there something we can do coming together to address that in California? And so we said we would attempt to do it. And the first thing we did was look, what is the major cause contributing to this wealth gap growing? And we quickly came to the conclusion was the gap in homeownership was increasing on it. Homeownership was the avenue that created the greatest middle class the world has ever seen. From 1930 to 1970, the government programs that helped lower and moderate income families buy their homes created an avenue to create generational wealth that led to a high quality of living, but it was mostly for white families. 98% of all of the mortgages that came out of from 1930 to 1970 that came out of those programs went to white families. So we said, look, the way has already been done before. There's an avenue of starting to close that home ownership gap, and that's through home ownership. And home ownership is already declining. We all know that here. So we said, let's find out what are the factors that are inhibiting the growth of home ownership in our community on it. And we came to the same conclusion that Dan said on it. The misuse of environmental regulations, and in particular, CEQA. What we found was 80% of the lawsuits that were, or use of CEQA to stop developments, housing developments, school developments, had nothing to do with the environment. What was happening was there were loopholes in CEQA that was being used by, we call them NIMBYs, people who didn't want that housing project in their community or that school or some other public program on it. And the loopholes were two major ones. One was in CEQA, the ability to file a lawsuit anonymously. It's one of the few places when you can sue somebody and you don't have to let them know who's suing. It's almost like putting a hood over your head on it. The other one was the ability to file duplicative lawsuits, that you could file lawsuit after lawsuit on the same development. We did an analysis of some of the major developments that were blocked by CEQA, and we found some of them had been sued 30 times to block it. And the main idea was to increase the cost, keep the developers and the community people in courts, increase the cost, where people get frustrated and stop doing it. So we said, what can we do to start addressing this? And well, let me know when I have a minute left, because I'll talk forever until I get shot on it. So we said, what could we do to try to change this? And so we decided to organize and educate our community so we could start to influence the legislators on it. So we said we set a goal of having 100 community leaders from across the state to work together on the policies that would change CEQA on it. And so we decided to do it through small community conferences. And we had the first one in Oakland, and 120 people showed up. Astounded us on it. We went from Oakland to Fresno, from Fresno to San Bernardino, Riverside, San Diego, Los Angeles, Sacramento, and we still have a few more, Ventura, and I'm probably missing some. 832 people, community activists, signed up and says we want to work together to change this situation and change CEQA on it. So we, in our naive way, says, well, let's get a bill. Let's pass a bill that closes those loopholes. And little did we, boy, did we learn a lesson. We put a bill up and boy, we got blindsided and killed from the legislators that we thought were our friends. We said, what's happening here on it? You know, people of color, the legislators of color, were killing a bill that closed two little loopholes in CEQA that was being misused on it. So we said, we're going to get stronger, we're going to get better, we'll do something on this. So we said, there's we came to the conclusion there were other populations, there was only minorities that were being affected by the lack of access to home ownership, but there were millennials. Millennials is first generation whose quality of life is going to be less than their parents, and college students. College students coming out of college with this huge student debt, and their ability to start a family and buy a home, but that's that big. So we increased our organization to those, and we call ourselves now M&Ms, minorities, millennials, and students. It has a ring to it. Another thing that we did was we looked at what CARB was doing. Does everybody know what CARB is? California Air Resources Board. And they came out with a new scoping plan. The new scoping plan was even going to make CEQA even stronger and worse in our community on it. So we sued it. the new scoping plan on it. And we're in the middle of the lawsuit. And they couldn't understand, the leaders of CARB couldn't understand why we were suing them. So we had a first settlement meeting, and they brought in nine attorneys and scientists, et cetera, to deal with us. Can you imagine in the settlement, they came to work with us on it. Not one of the 9 people in there was a Latino or an African American. And they couldn't understand what they were doing, how it was impacting our community. Anyway, that's where we're at right now. The critical thing I think I want to leave with you is what's happening right now is not only affecting our communities in M&Ms, it's affecting the future of California, California's economy. These 3 populations will be carrying the burden of support for California. And the way for them to increase their wealth and be able to support their families and have a higher quality of life is going to be through access to home ownership. 95% of all the homes being built today by affordable and nonprofit organizations are rentals on it. Unless we start doing something now to address that, the misuse of the environment regulations, the future looks really, really dim. These 3 populations, the M&Ms, are going to be the burden of support for the state in the future. It's going to be dim, but also for 4 million more seniors who will soon be retiring. That burden's going to fall. And now we have enough tension already today between races and ethnic groups. We're going to have another tension between ages. Thank you.
Do we have
Time for a few questions.
Excellent.
You wanna raise your hand.
Kind of amazing that CEQA somehow, kind of amazing how CEQA is completely devastating the homeownership market. While this brand new beautiful stadium right around the corner, somehow the legislators were able to get CEQA completely away from that project. Why don't you use examples like that to help your lawsuits and your movement against CEQA? Because, I mean, that's a huge example. And I talk to people every day that don't even know that CEQA was completely abandoned with the sports center.
Not only in the sports center in Sacramento, but also the one that's being built in Los Angeles, the stadium that's being built for the Warriors in San Francisco, and the one that's being contemplated for the A's in Oakland. All of those stadiums get an exemption from CEQA. But do you want to build some homes for moderate income families? They don't get that exemption. We raised that with the legislators on it, and they said, yeah, it's a shame. We just don't have the same impact as special interest groups, but that will change very soon.
Any others?
And it's specifically to you, Mr. Gamboa. I learned a lot today from you. I want to know, your organization is moving forward and trying to explain and inform populations of color and aged people. Who besides you and maybe PRI is participating in this kind of movement, if any?
Well, I gave the list of the leaders of the organization, but we have from each community, we have a designated leader that represents that geographic area. But that we by the way, we're all volunteers on it.
That's my next question. How are you financed?
Yeah. We're all volunteers, but we're financed from foundations, some corporations. In fact, if I may, we have found real quickly was because we bring a moral high ground into this particular fight that many people have wanted to use us. Realtors have wanted to use us in their fight, developers have wanted to use us in their fight, and others on it put us up in front. there was a discussion this last year about putting an initiative up to close the loopholes in CEQA, and all these organizations wanted to put us up in the front and fund us. We says, no, we're not for sale.
I should also mention that there's a fantastic video that they've put together that's it's available on YouTube, and I think, Tim, you're going to also, from our website, send it out to everyone so that you should, it's about 10 minutes long?
12 minutes?
12 minutes, but it's a fantastic video and definitely worth seeing. Any other questions? Do we have time for one more?
One more.
Excellent. This one, right up front.
I was just wondering if you could maybe take a minute and tie kind of both of your expertise together and talk about the California Energy Commission's mandate for solar panels on new housing.
You want to go first?
No, you go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, generally my feeling is if you have to mandate something, that's a good sign that it's not economically competitive if people aren't choosing to do it on their own. And again, I think it speaks to transferring the costs to other people. What you see with a lot of subsidies is you concentrate benefits to certain industries and you disperse the costs among the rest of the people as taxpayers and as ratepayers. You see it with policies like the renewable fuel standard that mandates that we blend ethanol into our gas tank. It gets a lot of support from Iowa and then disperses the costs amongst the rest of us. And it's that same type of notion when you're mandating the use of electricity generation and saying you need to have 25% of your renewables or 25% of your electricity needs met by renewables. And if you're mandating the use of solar, you're essentially doing the same thing. You're concentrating those benefits to certain industries who have lobbied very hard to get those subsidies and protections. And then I think the dangerous thing is once these policies are put in place, they're very difficult to get rid of, as we've seen with something like the ethanol mandate. I mean, most environmental organizations now don't like the ethanol mandate because of all of the unintended environmental consequences, not to mention the fact that it raises our energy prices. And so I think, stopping it before anything can get implemented would be critical before bad policies are kept in place.
Yeah, you said it very well. The subsidies for solar panels and others are disproportionately paid for by the poor who can't exercise the subsidies on it. So richer people that can afford to pay for the solar panels with subsidies get them, but the poor people pay them for their taxes. And
Yeah, I would say you don't create more affordable housing by making housing more expensive.
One other issue that's been a challenge, in the past has been if these solar panels are not bought outright but leased, and then you can have liens on your house when you're trying to resell it. I know that's been a problem in a number of different states.
One more.
Well, sure. One more question?
So, sorry, no, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, yeah.
So in France, obviously, they're 90% nuclear. I was wondering, is it plausible for the federal government to run a program where we were able to access our natural gas? So they built the infrastructure. Is it possible to, because we have so much natural gas in the United States, but we have no infrastructure to be able to access it. Even at centralized fueling stations, you have it a little bit, but could we build a network like that across the country like you've seen in Israel that they've done with their battery-operated vehicles and how they have the infrastructure all over their entire country? Could we do that? Would that be financially viable? And what are your thoughts on that?
Just to clarify, when you say natural gas, do you mean for electricity generation or for vehicles?
For vehicles. So combustible engines. And Germany's has like probably 75% of their cars have combustible engines, and so they access natural gas.
Yeah, I think it's possible. And you see companies doing it already on their own without any subsidies from the government. There's some small subsidies, which again we'd like to get rid of. But companies like FedEx and UPS that have set routes and know where the refueling infrastructure needs to be, they're investing on that already on their own. I think there's 150 million cars in the United States that already have some capacity to run on either liquefied natural gas or compressed natural gas. So I think the way I see it is that there's certainly possibilities for it. And the way I think if it's going to happen, it's kind of going to happen like cell phones happened in the United States. Cell phones started very small, and there was always this argument that policymakers needed to intervene because there's a chicken and egg problem that, you're not going to buy a natural gas vehicle if there's no refueling infrastructure. You're not going to have a cell phone if there's not a cell phone tower. But you saw companies make those investments, and then it exploded all across the country. And I think given the fact that we have a lot of cheap, abundant natural gas that's not going away anytime soon, if you talk to these companies, they say it's like turning on a faucet to get this natural gas. I think it's very possible.